Hey, do you ever wonder how the top chefs get the most flavorful steaks or roasts every time? Well, it does matter about what cut you have. What they do really well is they nail the seasoning and the method. I'm Craig Tafaro, and I want to talk to you today about how to do that in your own kitchen. So the number one thing from my perspective as a butcher and hobby chef that I could share with you that I've learned from top chefs is that you need to salt your meat. Now, I'm not just talking about putting some table salt out on the table and sprinkling it on when you go to take your bites. I'm talking about salting your meat as the seasoning ahead of cooking. Now, there's a science behind this that when you apply salt to meat, there's a chemical reaction that occurs. You probably remember from middle school or high school class the concept, and it's the osmotic exchange when salt wants to travel across cell membranes so that there's a balancing and equalization of the salinity on the meat and in the meat. So literally, after you salt your meat, the salt is not just sitting on the outside, but within about 30 to 60 minutes, salt is starting to travel into the meat. Now, if you take a whole roast and you apply salt about 24 hours in advance or so, by the time you cook that meat 24 hours later, the salt will have made its way all the way in to the interior of that roast. So now, when you go to cut your roast and you serve it, you're not just getting a little burst of flavor on the outside, but you have a fully seasoned piece of meat in every bite. So I want to share just a couple of rules of thumb when it comes to salting your meat in advance. Number one, the amount of salt. I would suggest that you start with approximately a quarter of a teaspoon of table salt or a half a teaspoon of kosher salt per pound of uncooked meat. Your palate is going to determine where you want to take it from there. If you want to scale back the salt, you need to increase the salt. Just play with it, but that's a good starting point for most palates. Second is the time. Now, this is going to depend on the size of the meat and how much fat is on the meat. See, salt doesn't travel through fat the same way it travels through lean muscle mass. So if you have a fat cap on, let's say, a Boston butt roast from a pig, the salt that's over the fat is not going to travel the same way as the salt on the underside that's touching directly to the lean meat. So take that into consideration. But generally speaking, for smaller, leaner cuts, like let's say a filet from a beef, filet mignon, you don't need to salt that 24 hours in advance. You could salt that, let's say, 1 to 2 hours in advance of cooking. You could even salt it just about an hour before cooking. What you don't want to do is salt it for, let's say, 20 to 30 minutes before cooking, because all that's going to do is, as that initial chemical reaction is taking place, the salt is breaking through cell walls, there's a movement of water out of the cells, and before that water is then reabsorbed through that balancing, that moisture might be left behind on the plate or the dish that you salted in. So if you are going to salt ahead of cooking, make sure you do it either far enough in advance, at least 40 to 60 minutes, or immediately as you're putting the meat in the pan. So in traditional cookbooks, when you hear the term seasoning, and this is still the case in many high-end culinary schools, the idea being presented is salting. Salt is the seasoning for the meat. The other things that we talk about as seasonings today are aromatics, herbs, spices, but the seasoning process is the meat actually making its way, the salt making its way into the meat. So this, I think, is the thing that generally is the primary distinguishing factor between why when you go out to a steakhouse, you say, oh my gosh, that steak was so good. Why can't I ever make something like that at home? It's because that steakhouse chef is putting way more salt than you would ever put on your steak at home. You've got to get comfortable with actually putting the amount of salt needed to properly season your meat. The next thing that you need to consider are those other flavorings. What herbs, what spices, what aromatics are you going to use? And this can largely depend on your culinary background, your family heritage, your part of the world, your part of the country. But there are some general ideas by meat type that you can follow. And I think what you want to do before you get into any very specialized way of seasoning meat or spicing meat is start with a very basic level of seasonings. Start with salt. get your salting down, add in some black pepper, maybe some garlic, and really you could stop there. In fact, our most popular seasoning blend that we sell at Melvin Hill Meats, we call Simply Good. And this is salt, pepper, and garlic. It's got a little something special in that we toast the pepper before grinding and mixing. It brings out a more of a nutty character in the pepper, but this is a really awesome blend that you could season any cut of meat with and enjoy eating it. That being said, here are a few examples by meat type of directions you can go with the spices and herbs and aromatics. Beef, for example, has a very robust flavor on its own. It can stand up to some stronger flavors. Herbs like rosemary, a lot of black pepper, bringing in maybe some strong Mediterranean herbs, even going the route of adding oregano and a lot of garlic can play well with beef. You could also go more of a South American route of including more of a chili and garlic character. The beef is very versatile, but it can stand up to those robust flavors of, let's say, a very smoky, spicy chipotle chili, for example, or to have a heavily crusted outside of a smoked beef brisket that's basically entirely black pepper. The beef stands up to that, whereas if you did that to a chicken breast, you might not want to eat it, or you definitely won't enjoy it as much as you will with beef. Pork has more of a mild flavor than beef. In some ways, pork is just as versatile as beef, and you can include a lot of the same flavorings that you would in beef when it comes to pork. But one thing that's different is you might think of, let's say, a holiday ham that has a lot of warm spices and brown sugar, maybe maple syrup, maybe a honey glaze. Pork has been known to play really well with the sweet and savory spices. And that's something that you can explore in your own kitchen, not just with a holiday ham, but when you're, let's say, roasting a pork loin, you can still work in a glaze that has a sweet character to it. Pork also plays really well with vinegar-inspired condiments such as mustard. So you might use mustard as a base in your sauce, or maybe you include a vinegar-based sauce or a wine-based sauce. For example, taking the shoulder of pork, often the Boston butt from the top of the shoulder of the pork is the prime smoking piece of pork, low and slow until it's fall apart tender. But you could also take that instead of like a southern smokehouse style and pick up a traditional French style where you braise that pork shoulder roast in red wine with carrots and onions and aromatic herbs like thyme and rosemary. And that's a delicious meal. But the important thing is you're including that sweet vinegar character from the red wine, along with the sweet, savory character of the carrots and the onions. And that pork just plays really well with those sorts of flavors. So when it comes to chicken, I highly recommend keeping it simple, especially if you're just getting into, let's say, cooking a whole chicken. I encourage you to just start with salt and pepper. Maybe you slide a head of garlic and a halved lemon inside of the cavity while you're cooking, maybe some aromatic herbs inside. But in terms of what you're putting on the flesh of the bird, start really simple. You can't go wrong with a delicious chicken that's rubbed with salt and pepper. It's going to be good. Chicken, though, is really versatile. And maybe I've said this about all of the meats so far, but it is. I mean, it is the white meat. It can go in any flavor direction you want. So even though I encourage you to keep it simple and just take the traditional approach of salt, pepper, garlic with a little lemon maybe, you could go the route of really bold flavors, like with a chicken curry, where you include some heat as well as some warm spices. You could go a South American route where there's a lot of cumin, some chili in there as well. Really, the chicken can take to those bold flavors, and it lets the bold flavors really shine through because it doesn't have a bold flavor on its own. All right, so the last one I want to talk about is lamb. Lamb, in some ways, you could think of like beef in that it's bold on its own, and so it can withstand bold flavoring. There's the very common tradition of lamb being served with mint or a mint chutney or a mint jelly. Mint is a very pungent herb on its own, and from my palate, it's a little bit overpowering to the lamb. I'd prefer the lamb to shine through more, but that is a common thing to serve mint with lamb. I'd prefer something more like some rosemary and thyme and a braise, maybe in some wine, or if I'm going to do a roast, I might keep it generally simple with salt and pepper and some aromatic herbs in the pan around the lamb. But really, lamb, I think, is just as versatile as any of the other meats that I've talked about in this video. It's just not as commonly eaten in the United States, and so people don't have a lot of experience with it. I'd encourage you to explore lamb further. Make sure you're getting it from a source that you can trust, that you actually know it's true lamb. A large portion of what's sold as lamb in the stores is probably actually mutton. It might be much older than lamb, properly speaking, which is why the flavor is sometimes not as desirable. People might describe it as gamey, which might be why they turn to the mint to try and cover it up. But I'd encourage you, find a good source of lamb. It is really delicious. It's got a natural richness to it, and it plays well with a variety of flavors, just like beef, pork, and chicken. So one method you can keep in your kitchen toolbox that's somewhat related to the dry brining or the adding of salt in advance of cooking is marinating. This is probably one that you're more familiar with. It's a more common practice, but the concept is similar. You're taking a cut of meat before you cook it, and you're adding seasonings to it so that the meat is flavored and it's infused with some moisture, so it's going to come out as a more moist product. And in some cases, you're actually going to tenderize that meat, depending on what you're using in your marinade. If you do go the route of using a marinade to actually help tenderize a tough cut of meat, let's say a London broil, which is basically a large steak cut out of the back hind quarter of a beef. It's typically a tough section of meat. If you use a marinade to help tenderize that cut of meat with using vinegar or some citrus or wine, something that has a low pH that's actually going to help break down muscle tissue, you do need to be careful that you don't leave it too long. And actually, you can accomplish a similar goal by going the other way on the pH scale by using baking powder or baking soda in a solution. So now you have an alkaline solution that's going to do something similar, breaking apart protein bonds in the muscle so that when you bite into it, it doesn't have the same toughness. It's going to fall apart more easily in your mouth. That's something that you're going to have to experiment with at home, because depending on the amount of vinegar or the amount of baking soda that you use and how strong that solution is, you may only want to leave your meat in the marinade for, let's say, 20 to 30 minutes. If it's a gentler solution, you might be able to get away with overnight. Okay, so far I've basically highlighted two main ways of getting salt into your meat, infusing your meat with flavor before you cook it. One is the dry method and one is the wet method. They both can work, but they have different applications based on the cut of meat, and they're executed a little bit differently. So for a dry approach, this just means that you're putting a dry substance onto the surface of the meat and you're letting that sit before cooking. So you're going to put salt directly on, or you might start with a dry rub. In the case of smoked meat, this is really common to use a dry rub, something like our busted butt seasoning, which is a pork dry rub. This already has salt in it, along with a number of other seasonings, spices, garlic powder, onion powder. The spices include things like paprika, a little bit of ground rosemary, onion powder, and that's going to give you a really nice crust on the outside of your meat, because the salt's going to penetrate, but those larger molecular structured items like, let's say, rosemary is not going to make it into the center of the meat. It's going to hang on the outside. But when you allow that seasoning layer to hang out on the meat, it does create a crust on the outside, so that when you go to take a bite out of it, after you slice it and take a bite out of it, you have this nice crunchy layer bursting with flavor on the outside, the bark on the outside of a smoked piece of meat. So that can be a really delicious approach. It's great for particularly cuts that have a little more fat to them, so that they stay moist and tender as they cook over a longer period. to get that dry, crusty outside. The other method being the wet method, which I've described a marinade. There's also a wet brine option, which is just simply a salty solution of water in its simplest form. Commonly for, let's say, a whole ham, like a Christmas ham, you're gonna submerge that, or maybe a Thanksgiving turkey is gonna get submerged in a wet brine that might have salt, water, juice, potentially some source of acid, whether it's an alcohol or vinegar directly, potentially some other spices, but those spices aren't going to make their way very much into that meat. The main thing you're accomplishing in a wet brine is the same thing you're accomplishing in a dry brine, which is salt penetration into the meat. With a marinade, you're accomplishing that as well because you're going to have salt in your marinade. It's basically a wet brine, but with a higher amount of some acidic solution, whether that's citrus or that's vinegar directly, and that is going to speed up the process. So that's usually used for leaner cuts, like let's say a flank steak that's known to be lean and a little tough on its own because it has really long muscle strands. So that vinegar solution is going to help break down the protein bonds in the meat more quickly than, say, if you just put that into a wet brine without the vinegar aspect. All right, so I briefly want to touch on cooking techniques or methods. Now, if you want to go in depth on methods and get the full scoop across all of them, check out my ebook, How to Cook Any Meat Well, and you can get this for free. There'll be a link in the show notes, links in my bio as well. So check it out. What I want to jump in though, just in this video, is to touch on a couple of main points that you want to consider when you're thinking about approaching meat like a top chef. I'm going to mention two high-level things to consider. One is the sear. So this could happen in a hot pan with some fat where as soon as the meat hits the pan, it's sizzling away and starting to brown. That sear is going to create that outer crust and help to lock in some of the moisture that may otherwise want to leave the meat. This can also happen in an oven at a high temperature. So let's say you have a loin roast, whether from beef, pork, lamb, or a whole chicken where you want to help crisp up the skin and lock in some of that moisture. At a high heat in the oven, you can have a similar effect. So the goal here is to use high heat, whether in a pan or in the oven, that creates a caramelized browned layer that helps lock in the moisture. This is really great as an approach for leaner cuts, like many steaks, a filet, for example. You can even use this on a ribeye, any smaller cut of meat where you want a fast sear to lock in the moisture so that as you finish cooking to get the right temperature to the center, you're not also losing as much moisture through evaporation. Okay, the second technique or method that I want to mention is slow cooking. Now this is going to help you get really deep, rich flavors out of a cut of meat. And generally the cuts that you're going to use here are the fattier cuts, the cuts that are generally tougher. So beef brisket, for example, pork shoulder, both of those being common, smoked meat muscles, as well as things like the shank. So if you can picture a cross-cut shank from beef or lamb, you're going to have the center where the bone is, and then the muscle hanging out around the bone. The Italians call it osso buco, the bone with a hole in it. Those cuts of meats have something in common, and that's that they have a lot of connective tissue. And when you apply a low, gentle heat over a prolonged period of time, you're actually going to break down all of that connective tissues and release the delicious gelatin. The fat is going to start to render, which is going to make the meat more juicy. And actually, instead of in a high heat setting where those muscles would end up contracting because of all the connective tissue, you're going to have a rendering, a breaking down, such that when you eat the meat, it's going to be fall apart tender. This is what you're going for in a chuck roast or in certain rump roast out of the beef, as well as what all the smoke chefs are going for when they're using a brisket or a pork shoulder. Okay, the last tip I want to mention for you to keep handy is that you should rest your meat before cutting into it after cooking. Okay, I want to use this kitchen towel for a visual as I describe this, because when you cook meat, imagine that this is a bundle of muscle fibers. at a molecular level. You have all these little fibers here, and when you apply heat, it's kind of like when you go to wring out a towel. You're causing the sheathing on the outside of the muscle fibers to contract under that heat, which causes the muscles to get compressed. And that's going to tend towards expelling moisture away from those muscle fibers. So if you've cooked your meat properly though, high fast heat for a tender cut or a low and slow heat for a tougher cut, what's going to happen as you let that meat rest is actually any of that contraction that had started to happen at a molecular level, when the heat is no longer there, that muscle can start to relax. It's like this towel unfolding, so that now all that pressure that was on moisture to send it away from the muscle can then be redistributed throughout the whole muscle strand. So with a smaller cut, like let's say you cook a filet and you keep it at medium rare, you really don't need more than 5, maybe 10 minutes at the most, depending on the thickness, how big your filet was cut, to let those juices redistribute so that when you bite into it, every cut is going to be juicy and delicious. For a larger cut, like let's say a whole roast, you might want to go as long as 15 to 20 minutes before actually slicing it and serving it. If you took a 4-pound top round roast, cooked really well to a medium temperature, and you took it out of the oven and immediately sliced into it and started serving it, it would feel dry in your mouth and it would look dry on the plate. Whereas if you leave it, just let it sit for 15 minutes before cutting into it, now when you cut it, each slice is going to have a nice little pool of juices and it's going to be more tender and enjoyable to eat. All right, so to recap, we've talked about properly salting your meat, properly flavoring your meat, that is keeping it simple and letting the meat play its role and shine through. We've talked about the different ways of doing that, using a dry brine approach or a wet approach like a marinade. Then we talked about the different cooking techniques of a high fast heat for tender cuts or a slow low heat for the tougher cuts. Lastly, I recommended to you, let your meat rest before cutting into it. If you follow these tips, you're well on your way to enjoying every cut of meat that you cook. Make sure to follow us for more tips on choosing, preparing, and cooking the best meat for your friends and family. And if you're looking for high quality meat to stock your freezer, check out our link or go to melvinhillmeats.com.